Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. This is your brother Naveed Akhtar, and welcome to the very first episode of our podcast series. And it is of great honor to be joined by Mufti Muntasir Zaman from Dallas, Texas, who is an outstanding scholar, mashallah. May Allah reward him. And Mufti Sahab has written many works, particularly in the field of hadith and manuscript transmission. But even if we keep all the achievements aside, to be honest with you, there is one thing that stands out, and it is his humbleness. Allahumma barik. He is very much down to earth. So, Mufti Sahab, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Thank you for joining us today. It's a privilege to have you.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Mufti Naveed. MashaAllah, my brother in Islam, my colleague, someone I look up to for the beautiful work that you do. Jazakallah khairan for inviting me on the platform.
So, sir, before we start with the actual discussion, it would be beneficial if you could just inform our audience about your educational background.
Sure. Myself, I'm born and raised in New York, originally in America. My parents are ethnically from Bangladesh. But I was born in the US, typical upbringing, did my hifz very early on. And I went to start my Alamiya journey in South Africa. Sorry, I started in Canada, where I did a few years of, I'dadiyya, Ula, Thaniya. Then I go to South Africa. I complete my Alamiya. 2013, I complete my Alamiya in Darul Ulum Azadville. And then from there, I join Darul Ifta Mahmoudiyya with Mufti Ibrahim Desai Sahab, Allah yarhamu, our teacher. And I was there, and then I joined after that the Takhasus fil Hadith program in a place not too far from Darul Mazadville, a place called Benoni. I studied the Takhasus program over there, and then eventually finished my Ifta, a decent amount of the Takhasus fil Hadith. 2015, I go to England. That's where I get my master's in Islamic studies in Markfield Institute. And I finish in 2017. I come back, and just typical story of alim, where we try to do khidmah as soon as possible. But despite whatever journey I may have experienced, I think the one thing that sticks out to me all the time is it's less about where you study and more about how and what you study. So I have had the opportunity to study in some prestigious madaris, but I think what had a greater impact on me were some of the specific teachers I know, such as Mufti Rahman Azami, Mufti Hussein Kadodia, Mufti Ibrahim Desai Sahab, who, each impacted me khuluqan wa ilman wa taqwa in different angles, and I appreciate that immensely, even though I may not be the best representation of their turath and their khidmah.
Mufti Sahab, you have already spoken extensively in your previous conversations about the transmission and the preservation of hadith. So I'll try to avoid those questions for now, and I'll try to focus on other issues and other questions. So I feel that it's better to start with seemingly problematic hadith.
Yeah.
Right. So when a person encounters a hadith which, according to him, may seem to conflict with his reason or archaeological, historical, or scientific findings, or it may merely be a matter of moral discomfort. So what should a person examine first before declaring that the hadith itself has a genuine problem?
Yeah, this is a thorny topic, one that I think important for us to realize predates the modern time. The topic of al-hadith al-mushkil, as Imam Tahawi very famously sharh mushkil al-athar and ta'wil mukhtalif al-hadith of Ibn Qutayba and others. This was a challenge very early on, because when we say something is mushkil, something is problematic, the problem can stem from different angles. It can be linguistic. It's problematic in that I failed to grasp what the hadith is saying. You find some of the Sahaba asking the Prophet ﷺ even about verses in the Quran. وَلَمْ يَلْبِسُوا إِيمَانَهُم بِظُلْمٍ. What does ظُلْمٍ mean for them? So from a particular angle, there's an ishkal for them. They're trying to grasp what this means in the Quran. And this is also true in the hadith. Now, when we say a hadith is problematic, there are levels to this. One level is the hadith genuinely is problematic in its transmission because there's a da'if narrator, there is a problematic, weak memory, weak, adala, probity, in one of the narrators, therefore we consider problematic. However, in the modern day, when we talk about problematic hadith, generally it's this clash between the modern worldview and what we can call the worldview of Islam, and particularly the worldview of hadith. We're very tempted in the modern day, the moment something makes us feel uncomfortable, that we throw it away. Scholars have classically dealt with this problem under the genre of mushkilul hadith and mukhtaliful hadith, and they provide a framework for us. And everything begins with the basic question of authenticity, right? When I'm dealing with a hadith, is that hadith authentic? Or am I dealing with a spurious hadith, therefore I don't really need to think about it? There are a number of ahadith that circulate, they make the rounds, and they're not authentic, so I don't really need to worry about it. But when the hadith is authentic, and it's easy to just, cop out and say the hadith is inauthentic and we don't need to worry about it. A good percentage of hadith that people are struggling with in the modern day tend to be hadith found in the vaunted collections of the Sahihain, Bukhari, Muslim, and other collections. So now the bigger question is, how do I deal with it? There are different ways. In my book, I kind of address this, in that if a Muslim believes that the Prophet ﷺ speaks only the truth, then his or her first reaction should be, how can I take my deeply held positions and try to make sense of it in light of the hadith instead of in contradiction to the hadith? So if the hadith is saying something like Aisha radiallahu anha married the Prophet ﷺ at a young age, instead of imposing modern marital ethics onto the hadith, maybe I should try to make sense of what was considered absolutely normal at that time. 7th century Arabia, marriages were very different. The issue of science. Do I look at the hadith from a scientific angle, or do I say that no, Nabi SAW is using a metaphor? The famous hadith of Sujud al-Shams, that the sun is prostrating beneath the arsh. Maybe it's not meant to be taken literally, right? So I think the first step is for us to give it a second chance and be a little humble and say that the hadith may be perfectly fine, but I'm just reading it not the way I ought to. Understandably, that doesn't always work because of takalluf. Sometimes we're going to extreme measures and trying to square a circle, like it's not meant to be and it just doesn't work. At that case, we do tarjih, and we will say, whatever my deeply held assumptions are about science, about physics, about archaeology, about history, I'm going to have to suspend my judgment and trust the hadith. Right? Now, this is a very complex process because science isn't this Western propaganda machine that is trying to remove our faith. When we look at science in its most basic form, elementary form, we're talking about the laws of biology, the laws of physics, our understanding of the world around us, and that is something established in the Quran and Sunnah. So we have to see, is the point of science and archaeology that I am so troubled by a fact? Is it a theory? Is it an idea? Is it an hypothesis? And then accordingly, I try to see what the hadith. If the hadith is mutawatir, it is definitively transmitted, then at some point, I will just have to say the hadith is more reliable and I'll see if the science is correct or not. But if the hadith is a khabar wahid and there's ikhtilaf and there's a variation in the routes of transmission, and the scientific archaeological point tends to be robust, then there's absolutely nothing wrong in saying perhaps the hadith may have some riwayah bil ma'na, there's a waham or a khata, and that's not to dismiss the hadith tradition, but one point of data.
So, sir, for better clarity, perhaps I can bring an example. It's an asar of Ibn Abbas, not a hadith, where he speaks about the 7 earth and the 7 heavens, right? So, في كل أرض نبي كنبيكم. So, he said, in each earth there is a Nabi, there is an Ibrahim, there is Nuh, there is Ibrahim, and there is Isa. Imam Hakim, rahmatullahi alayhi, he brought this hadith. He said, Sahih isnad. I'm just bringing this question because at the end I'll be asking a question. So, Imam Hakim, he said Sahih isnad. Then came Imam Bayhaqi. He said, Isnaduhu Sahih, walakinnahu shazun bimara. It is extremely shaz and then it's extremely anomalous. Then Imam Suyuti followed his footsteps and he said that I agree with Imam Bayhaqi. And then he goes on to say, فَإِنَّهُ لَا يَلْزَمُ مِنْ صِحَّةِ الْإِسْنَادِ صِحَّةُ الْمَتْنِ. Just because a chain of a hadith is sound, it doesn't entail the soundness of the matan, right? We have two approaches so far. Then we have someone like, if I'm mistaken, just correct me, like Mullah Ali Qari Rahmatullahi alayhi and others who completely disregarded this asar and they said it's a fabrication. Three approaches so far. Some said it's Israeliyat. And then we have someone like Allama Arusi who comes up and he says that there is nothing in this hadith or in this asar that goes against the rational mind. So I just read Sheikh Awama's quote about this hadith when he speaks about this. He mentions the act of Imam Bayhaqi and Imam Suyuti and those who followed him. He says, this is taz'ifun lahu bil faham. This is weakening the report based on one's understanding, right? So, and then he goes on to say, this is a dangerous approach because it requires deliberation and caution. And then he says, a meaning of a hadith which remains obscure from one individual or from one scholar may be clear to others, right? So, with so much differing assessments and so much diverse opinions, whom does a person choose? For example, a person who is dealing with 8 keys and Munkirine Hadith, the easiest way seems to be that of Imam Suyuti and Imam Bayhaqi. Just dismiss the Hadith, say it's Za'ib. As Imam Suyuti himself says, إِذَا تَبَيَّنَ ضُعْفُ الْحَدِيثِ فَأَغْنَى ذَلِكَ عَنْ تَعْوِيلِهِ. If the weakness of a report is established, there is no need for an interpretation. We don't have to explain it, right? So that seems to be the easiest way. But is this approach correct that we choose an opinion which suits us and discard everything else?
So that's a good question, and I think it's not limited to the field of hadith. This idea of difference of opinion and the vast and rich, diverse history, intellectual history that we have spans theology, law, hadith, and it strikes at a more complex issue of how do you look at different opinions and what is the yardstick of truth. Insofar as the hadith tradition is concerned, this athar in particular is very interesting because you'll have scholars in the question of evolution, in the question of extraterrestrial existence, try to use this hadith to talk about other beings outside of humans and other planets. So now they're using their understanding to strengthen the hadith. Other people find this hadith theologically problematic in that how could you have multiple prophets? Is that, theologically feasible? What about the centrality of human beings? And the truth of the matter is there are two things to bear in mind. For the average person who's not seeking to answer any fundamental questions of life, not any polemics, any debates, they're just looking for some clarity. On a personal level, consistency is key. If they have a hadith scholar whom they trust, if they have a scholar whose verdicts they take recourse to, I think that's the safest option. That, you know what, in the hadith on the age of Aisha, I've been listening to Fulan Sheikh and I just be consistent. Whatever his approach is in the Athar of Ibn Abbas, go ahead. Once we get into more high stakes issues, right? You're a researcher trying to get to the bottom of something. You are debating with people who reject hadith. You yourself are trying to do da'wah and a problematic hadith comes and there is this plethora of opinions. How do you choose between which one is right without being arbitrary? And I think the answer requires, one, a level of sincerity, but two, a realization that even if I go with an anomalous view, let's say I go with the view of Suyuti on this, and I tend to find it a little convenient. Alternatively, I find what Alusi says more accurate, and I side with him. As long as the spectrum of views fall within acceptable scholarship, and none of those views are baseless, then I personally feel it's okay to go with either view, even if it is just one scholar. So if I go with the way Bayhaqi approaches this or the way Suyuti approaches this, and I feel to myself that, you know what, it's causing me a lot of tension, I'm not able to understand it. One, this is a non-prophetic report, right? So the stakes are much lower. And number two, it's a single strand transmission. It's one person, khabar wahid. Rejecting it will not have huge implications. I feel like when you do muwazana, when you weigh the pros and the cons, sometimes in certain cases, and I say this very selectively, it's better for a person to maybe not accept the hadith than use the doubts that are generated by the hadith to cause and take root and result in more serious problems in their approach to hadith. I think to wrap it up and summarize and answer your question, when you have multiple opinions, given that there's thubut and dalala, you have the transmission of the hadith and you have the meaning of the hadith.
Yes.
If the transmission and the meaning are very ambiguous and they allow for multiple readings, as long as some scholars within the realm of traditional scholarship express an opinion, even if they're isolated, even if it is like the Ibn Taymiyyah's, or even if it's the Ibn Shubruma's, or even if it is the Shah Waliullah views that sometimes people think are in the less popular opinions, I think in certain cases there should be some scope of acceptability instead of trying to force the issue.
So in that case, Musa, wouldn't every Shah's opinion be accepted?
Not
Like,
necessarily, not
everyone
at all. I think that's why I think it's so important to be clear here that not every situation has high stakes. So there are shadh opinions on multiple subjects. You go from the issue of, what's the famous statement of Awza'i? If you go with the qawl of Ahl Makkah on this, you go with the qawl of Ahlul Medina on that, you go to Ahlul Kufa, the issue of Nabi, the Mut'a, music. There are multiple, problematic shadh views, and by no means should people endorse all of the views. What I'm saying here is you have a hadith where there are multiple opinions, and not every isolated single opinion may be shadh. Like in this case, what Bayhaqi is doing isn't necessarily determined as shadh because the data that he's working with is so probable. It's very hard to say that he's on one side and 99% of scholarship was on the other side. Yes, in the case of Aisha radiallahu anha, the age issue isn't even a question of shadh. It's just flatly wrong according to me. But I think the bigger question is, do I now go and, do I die on that hill, making sure that that person accepts the age of Aisha radiallahu anha, even though I know that he's struggling with it, or let that person just, they say ignorance is bliss, especially when he's not a scholar and can't fully grasp some of the nuances.
Perfect. So, Musa, the case of Aisha, right? Radiallahu anha. So we have Sahih hadith and then we have historical records, right? So when a scholar grades a hadith as Sahih, what is he actually confirming? First thing. So for example, if I remember correctly, Imam Nawawi rahmatullahi in his Taqrib, he mentioned that some of the scholars, when they grade a hadith, they make a distinction. So for example, sometimes they use Sahihul Isnad and sometimes they use Hadithun Sahihun, right? This is to distinguish that maybe Sahihul Isnad may have some shuzuz or some illah in that hadith. So when a scholar grades a hadith as Sahih, does it mean that every word in the hadith is transmitted verbatim, and that every apparent meaning is intended certainly, or does it only mean that the transmission is correct, is reliable?
Yeah, so when a hadith is graded as sahih in the parlance of hadith scholars, it means that it meets those 5 requirements of adala, dabt, ittisal, adam al-shudud, adam al-illa, and it gives you a level of high probability. So we know that the spectrum of dhanni to qat'i, a hadith, when it is labeled as sahih, it does give you a level of confidence, but never reaches the level of qat'iyya. Which means that historically, even though a hadith is sahih, it doesn't mean it is a definite, irrefutable fact of the past. And this is a topic I discuss with my students in Mustalah, that there are two types of truths. There's what we can call historical truth, and then there's literal truth. Literal truth is when I think about yes and no questions, right? Like if you ask me about the phone, is the phone in my hand? It's a yes or no question. It's very simple. It's black and white. Did Genghis Khan exist? Yes or no, right? So big ticketed items, very easy for us to give a yes or no. The vast majority of our past, however, falls under a fog of improbability. Okay, we know Genghis Khan existed, but exactly how many wars did he participate in? How exactly can we speak about his upbringing? Now there's a degree of improbability. So I can't have 100% certainty. I'll have a level of confidence that goes anywhere from 0% untrue all the way to maybe 99%, which is very close to being true. Depending on the data and depending on the evidence that you have, your confidence in a piece of report constantly increases and increases. So when a hadith is sahih, I won't ever have 100% unless I have so many corroborating reports. I have a level of amal attached to it. Like the scholars famously say that a hadith is sahih about siwak. But there are so many sahih ahadith about this that a person can say with absolute confidence that the Prophet ﷺ actually used the miswak. Now, it's individually sahih, but collectively it gains a level of authenticity. Truth be told, the vast majority of hadith don't enjoy this level of what they call epistemological certainty, qat'iyya. They don't enjoy that. So that means you have functional certainty. Functional certainty, and the classical scholars have spoken about it. لا يوجب العلم ولكن يوجب العمل, right? I won't get this epistemological certainty, but it grants me enough confidence that I can practice on it in the relevant fields of, fiqh, perhaps even aqidah in some instances, in virtues, historical data. So I can use it, but understanding its limitations. That can I now use it to undermine a verse of the Quran or not? Like the apparent reading of a verse of a Quran? No, I cannot. Can I use it to do ta'weel of another hadith? And I think this is where we start getting into the nitty gritty, that to what extent do you use a sahih hadith, which is a khabar wahid, against other evidence? So you'll find Hanafi scholars saying that in the realm of fiqh, I know we may get into this as the conversation progresses, but this is where there's some difference of opinion, where some scholars say, yes, I grant the hadith sahih, khabar wahid, but it goes against this blueprint of the Sharia, this istiqara, this deductive reasoning that I have of what the Sharia encompasses to me, which is more encompassing. But the scholars of hadith, generally speaking, when a hadith would be authentic and it met these requirements, they would practice on it. Now, does that mean you can never revisit? You can never rethink it? Absolutely not. Because think of everything as this muwazana, as this comparison. If the hadith gives me, let's say, 70% confidence, but then my knowledge about history or my understanding about science gives me 90% confidence, well, now I have to go back to the previous conversation about what do I do with the hadith? Do I reconcile? Do I dismiss it? Do I reinterpret it? So it gives you that certainty, as opposed to something like قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in no uncertain terms His oneness. And I can't, no matter how convinced I am otherwise, bring in interpretation or bring in a rereading of this verse, because both its thubut and its dalala, its transmission and its indication are indisputable.
It might be a little controversial, but when we speak about the canonization of Sahihain, Bukhari and Muslim, so we just spoke about. So it doesn't mean that it's immune to scrutinization. It's not, right?
No.
Right. So
yeah. And, do you have a follow? Should I comment on that, or do you want to?
Yeah, sure. For example, Musaf, right? We have Darqutni. We can say that mostly he critiqued it technically. It's just the nitty gritties, right?
Yeah.
But there are many instances. For example, if I remember correctly, in Sahih Bukhari, in the chapter of Ri'an, right? So the wording in Sahih Bukhari itself is فُرِّقَ بَيْنَهُمَا, right? So the husband and wife, they did Riyan, and then the wording is فُرِّقَ بَيْنَهُمَا. The whole narration is in Abu Dawud, where it's clearly mentioned that that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam فَرَّقَ بَيْنَهُمَا. But when Imam Darqutni rahmatullahi alayhi, when he speaks about this hadith, he says that all of the students of Imam Zuhri, they reported that the husband already divorced his wife prior to receiving instruction from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? So when Ibn Hajar rahmatullahi alayhi in Fathul Bari, in fact Hadith Sari, the Muqaddimah, he says that Imam Bukhari knew about this defect, and that is the reason he said Furriqa bainahuma. He used the abbreviated and the abridged version for it. There's just an example that there are many hadiths which have been critiqued, right? So if in a present day, if someone comes up with such objections, in this case, Musab, how do we deal with it? Like, is it allowed? Is it, as you just said, it's not immune to scrutinization?
Yeah.
So,
I think there are two different viewpoints here because, as I alluded to earlier on, one viewpoint is that to what end? If we let people continuously nitpick at Sahih al-Bukhari, at some point they're nitpicking at the entire hadith tradition. And I accept that view and I respect that view. However, when you look at the traditional scholarship on hadith, I really like this conversation that they have in the books of Mustalah, right? They try to rank books of hadith at Taqsim al-Subai, where they say the most authentic hadith is that which comes in Bukhari and Muslim, and then which comes only in Bukhari, then only in Muslim, then ala shart al-Bukhari, so on and so forth. And Ibn al-Humam, the famous Hanafi hadith scholar of the Mamluk era, he has this critique of it where he says that this is tahakkum. Like, it doesn't really matter which book a hadith comes in. Classically, what always mattered was the hadith itself, the chain of transmission of the hadith, the background to the hadith. So sometimes when we start talking, the hadith comes in Bukhari and Muslim, and these are very important front-facing conversations we need to have so that we can protect the vaunted collections of Islam. But once you start getting into the specifics, you start realizing, wait a second, classically, Hanafi scholars have disregarded many ahadith of the Sahihain, from, issues of like Raf'ul Yadayn to like, just go through the typical, mutanaza' fi masail, and you'll find that they wouldn't practice on it. Yes, you can say they do ta'wil and they dismiss it. That's a different conversation. But I feel this statement of Ibn al-Humam personally may not be 100% in our context, but it gives us an inspiration that instead of focusing on collections, we need to focus on hadith. And when you look at a hadith, sometimes it could come in Bukhari, but another version comes in Sunan Abi Dawud, another comes in some juz, another one comes in some fawaid book. You put it all together, maybe another iteration of the hadith is more authentic. And you'll find this with scholars periodically, with Ibn Hajar, with Qurtubi, with Ibn Taymiyyah. The hadith of Sahihain, there's this list I came across about 100 to 200 different instances where scholars were critically engaging with it. But these scholars, they respect it. Ala ra'si wal ayn. You say anything inappropriate about these scholars, they'll respond right back. The question is more of an academic one. And that's what I want to emphasize here, that what is the motivation behind the critique? Is the critique does it stem from this broader discomfort with the mores and the vision of Islam? Or does it stem from an academic issue on this specific topic? And you'll find scholars tend to be a little uneasy when people are critiquing Sahihain, because it tends to fall under these more progressive, modernist bent scholars who are trying to literally undermine the edifice of Islam, and they're using Bukhari as a scapegoat. Whereas previous scholars, when they're interacting with the Sahihain, it's like maybe a handful of ahadith, although they're already bought into the general vision of Islam as traditionally understood.
with the advent of internet, everyone has access to hadith books, right?
Yeah.
So most people do not consult the original Arabic or the commentaries. They don't read it. They just get a screenshot or they just read an isolated narration. And they also have this issue with the ulama. They say that why do you stop us from reading hadith books on our own? As the famous saying of Sufyan ibn Uyayna, I guess, al-hadithu muzillatun illa lil fuqaha.
Mm.
He said this. So how do we see this, Musab? Does a particular screenshot or an isolated narration or probably an additional note, so does it lead to hadith seem to be problematic, whereas in the original context, it's not at all? Or when we collaborate on the hadith
Yeah.
together, we see that there's no problem at all.
Yeah. I think the first thing to emphasize is I don't think scholars will flat out say don't read hadith. What they generally suggest is read books of hadith that are written for the relevant audience. So obviously when Sufyan ibn Uyayna made that statement, مَضِلَّ إِلَّا لِلْفُقَهَا, that time hadith collections weren't organized in a way for general consumption. Whereas today, picking up Riyadh al-Salihin,
Yeah, that's right.
I think whoever makes that objection, they're just caricaturing the ulama. The ulama will say, go ahead, read. It's just that there's a natural bar of entry for any field. If you want to read something like Sahih al-Bukhari, well, good luck, because it's one of the most complicated books to weave through. If you're reading Sahih Muslim, understand his process of ta'leel, so on and so forth. Okay? Now, if we look at ahadith that are disconnected from their context, does it result in a lot of misunderstanding? 100%. But I will say, though, that there are different bubbles. Whether it's social media, whether it's in real life, the problems that people encounter with hadith tend to be different depending on which WhatsApp group you're on, right? Let's just put it that way. In some WhatsApp groups, the problem is it's filled with mawdu'at, all fabricated ahadith that are just making the rounds because people feel spiritually inspired. I'm in some of these groups because of family members and whatnot, right? You try your best, but one person hears one hadith about doing one thing that will get you into Jannah quickly, and mashallah, they're practicing on it. On the other hand, you have young professionals who are struggling with the content of hadith. A hadith is removed from its context. Interestingly, now that we speak about this, one of our colleagues, mashallah, he studied with Mufti Ibrahim Sahab, he sent me this screenshot about a Christian who says that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam says that you should lie to your wife, so don't follow him. Jesus says lying is from the devil, so follow Jesus. Shabash, mashallah. And then he quotes the hadith. And he misquotes the hadith. He says, يَحِلُّ الْكَذِبِ إِلَّا فِي ثَلَاث. لَا يَحِلُّ الْكَذِبِ إِلَّا فِي ثَلَاث. And then he quotes the hadith. And only Allah knows how many people read this hadith, how many Christians or, Muslims on the fence read this, and now they find themselves thinking like, wait a second, I can lie to my wife? Is the Prophet actually saying I can lie to my wife? Well, if you're not إِيَّاكُمْ وَالْكَذِبِ, there's so many ahadith about kadhib, فَإِنَّ الْكَذِبَ يَهْدِي إِلَى الْفُجُورِ, and there's so many ahadith on it. If you don't look at it collectively, you won't understand that this hadith that says you can lie to your wife, it's not saying you can lie to your wife. It means that if you need to say something nice to her in the spur of the moment, just so that you can settle a dispute, you don't outright lie, but you can bend the truth slightly, is very different than saying you can outright lie to your wife, which was taken out of context by that Christian apologist. So in certain circles, you have the complete opposite, where authentic hadith are now being taken out of their context. And the solution to this is very simple, but it's also very hard. Solution is consult the scholars. فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. And honestly, there are a lot of explanations available online in different languages, that hadith commentaries, hadith collections. There's a number of books now, mashallah, which is becoming more and more prevalent, where the commentary on hadith is now being translated. It's already done in Urdu, but now in English, people are translating like the tajreed of Az-Zaidi. They'll translate it and then they'll write an English commentary on it to give some context. You go to some websites, mashallah, they'll look at certain ahadith that are quote unquote problematic and then they'll give context. So the idea of just running with screenshots shouldn't work with anything. Mashallah, we just got done with the World Cup, right? The number of quotes and ascriptions that are making the rounds. You'll see somebody have this thing. What was it? Somebody was telling me about one of the soccer players from Norway, that he said all of these positive comments about Palestine and mashallah, we should be supporting Norway. Irrelevant point. Then you start looking it up, and then it's like, wait a second, this whole thing is fabricated. Something nothing to do with hadith, just about football. There's a screenshot that's making the rounds and it's riling everybody up that this person is a Zionist or this person is pro-Palestinian on a worldly issue, can make hundreds of people either be for you or against you. Now, the hadith, which has much more importance connected to it, when these screenshots make the rounds, I think the bare minimum a person should do is go and ask their local scholar. And if you don't have a scholar, nowadays we are somewhat qualified, somewhat to check online to see if some of the websites that I'm familiar with, Islam Q&A, Ask Imam, whatever, do they address it? Hadith answers, maybe it's found over there and I can get some clarity.
So one thing is being fabricated, and the other thing, as you said, is context, right? So it's necessary that we gather all the narrations together. So Imam Khatib Baghdadi rahmatullahi, he brings a quote of Imam Yahya ibn Ma'in, right? Where it says, لَوْ لَمْ نَكْتُبِ الْحَدِيثَ مِنْ ثَلَاثِينَ وَجْهًا لَمْ أَخَذْنَاهُ. Had we not recorded a hadith from 30 different routes, we would not have been able to understand it properly. But Musab, I want to get deeper into this. So a hadith might not be clear in one narration, it's explained in the other narration, right? It's mutlaq in one side, the other narration, it might be muqayyad, right? But isn't it true that in the Hanafi fiqh, a mutlaq remains mutlaq and the hukum is based on the mutlaq itself? So a different narration which is muqayyad, it doesn't have any effect on the mutlaq. Is it not true, sir?
That's a good point, but I will say though that the Hanafi approach to usul al-fiqh has a very specific function. And that function tends to be with, number one, fiqhi issues. And when we're talking about problematic hadith, we're now exiting the realm of fiqh into now issues of history and malahim and fada'il, where the same usul don't matter as much. Now, why don't those usul matter as much? Because it goes back to something Shah Waliullah is talking about. He says when you're reading like Bazdawi and Sarakhsi, and they talk about these usul of if something is mutlaq in one place, muqayyad in another place, you should not, do hamal of the mutlaq on the muqayyad. He says that oftentimes these fuqaha have furu' that are already established, and then they have these usul that they extrapolate from it. So the reason you cannot undermine that asal is because you're going to then undermine a mansus fara. So it's not that qaida is 100% indiscriminate. It just means in the realm of fiqh, the furu are so closely tied to the usul that undermining this mas'ala of muqayyad and mutlaq will then have a huge ramification on furu that are established. Exit the field of fiqh, and now you're talking about ahadith related to scientific issues, ahadith related to gender, ahadith related to war. Those same considerations don't apply anymore because you're not talking about fiqh, you're talking about a completely different domain. And I would say at that point, it's less about who said it, which madhab, it's more about which interpretation, which approach gives the most satisfactory answer.
That's a perfect point, Nisa. So these books like Naqlul Hadith, ala Manhaj al-Hanafiya, and all these books, so it's particularly related to fiqh issues only, right?
Yeah, and there's this paper by, I have a copy here, I'm not sure where it is, but there's a scholar, his name is Sheikh Hamza Bakri, many people may know him. He's done this study on Imam Abu Mansur al-Maturidi and his ta'wilatu Ahl Sunnah, his tafsir. And in his tafsir, how does he interact with ahadith that are not of a fiqhi nature, that are outside of fiqh? So these books, dirasat, hadithiyya ala manhaj al-Hanafiyya, naqd al-hadith ala manhaj al-Hanafiyya, they're applicable to a very specific realm. When you start, and that's the tricky part because we don't have too many examples of scholars applying the same level of criticism outside of fiqh using the same considerations. But this example of Abu Mansur al-Maturidi is very interesting because he starts talking about, the hadith of Ibrahim alayhi salam and thalathu kadhibat, the hadith of Musa alayhi salam and that the rock ran with his clothes, and a few other ahadith. You see him critiquing these ahadith. He's criticizing them. Even though they're found in authentic collections, you can find him being much more critical because he believes that it undermines Ismatul Anbiya. Right? So, and then you'll find somebody like Jassas al-Razi, the hadith of Sihrun Nabi, alayhi salam. He tends to be very critical. Quduri, Imam Quduri in his Tajreed, he actually criticizes the hadith of Sihr, even though it comes in the Sahihain, he was very critical with it. So I think what their approach was to non-fiqh hadith is not entirely clear, but I can comfortably say that I don't think it would be exactly apples to apples, that you can use the exact same principles of like, okay, if it is mursal, then we will definitely accept it, or like, there's inqita' zahir, inqita' batin, all these typical conversations that you have. But I feel there's a separate methodology. And I think more important is that in the modern day, and I think this is a big conversation that we need to have, what role does advancement in technology, in science, in archaeology play in us revisiting our approach to hadith? There's a scholar from Jordan, his name is Jamil Farid Abu Sara. He has this book called أثر العلم التجريبي على نقد الحديث الشريف. And his argument is quite solid that science today, it gives us a level of confidence that far exceeds things like shahada and oral witness and things like that, given how empirically sound it is. In many instances, not all the time. I understand the philosophy of science and, a paradigm shift. All of that stuff is in its own place. But in general, science does engender a level of ilm, a level of knowledge that now may make us think about our naqd of hadith. Is that a valid approach? And I think that's perfectly fine so long as it works within the framework of the scholars of hadith. And that's something I tried doing in my book on the height of Adam alayhi salam.
So this leads us to another question, sir. When we speak about Matn criticism, right? So, for example, Abdul Majid Ghawri sir, he has a series of books on hadith, right? So, for example, this book, Mabadi wa Ta'amuri ma'a Sunnati Nabawiyya. Not in this book, but this is just a khulasa, what he says. When sihat of a hadith is confirmed, right? Then after that, what should be done? This is what he says. This is just a khulasa. Verifying the authenticity of the hadith, then analyzing the hadith in the light of the Quran. Comparing the hadith with other related ahadith. Reconciling and prioritizing between conflicting ahadith. Interpreting the hadith in light of the circumstances and reasons for its narration. Understanding the hadith in its specific context and environment. Interpreting the hadith in light of the objectives of Sharia. Analyzing the hadith in light of its linguistics, legal and customary implications. Then he goes on to say about the first analyzing the hadith in the light of the Quran. He says, a hadith therefore cannot, I quote him, a hadith therefore cannot be properly understood unless it is examined in the light of the Noble Quran. Likewise, it is not possible for us to determine whether the text of the hadith is weak or sound, irrespective of its chain, except in the light of the Quran. So, Mr. He is not the first person to say this, right? It has always existed. But why do we see that their whole talk is revolving around the Sanad itself? Sanad is being analyzed, but when it comes to Matn, rarely do we see anyone who is engaging with the Matn itself. And those who do engage, they are labeled as Fasiq or Gubra or something like that. So how do we deal with that?
So the first thing is Matn criticism, which means an analysis of the hadith purely based on what the hadith says, not how it was transmitted. This existed very early on. I suggest the audience to check out the books of Dr. Jonathan Brown on this, where he says, did Matn criticism exist? The rules of Matn criticism, there are none. As well as many other scholars in the traditional field, they write on this issue. And the khulasa is, starting with as early as like Ibn al-Mubarak, Imam Muslim, Ya'qub ibn Shayba as-Sadusi, Imam Bukhari, Ibn Hibban, all of these scholars engage with Matn criticism in that they critiqued the Matn of the hadith. But oftentimes you have to discuss the isnad, because if the wording of a hadith is problematic, you're saying one of two things. Ibn Salah actually raises this. You're saying one of two things. Either you're saying, na'udhu billah, the Prophet ﷺ himself said something wrong, or you're saying someone along the line in the chain of transmission made a mistake and misattributed something to the Prophet ﷺ. If that is the case, once we identify a problem in the Matn, we have to go back and figure out what the problem in the sanad is. So the problem isn't that scholars never did Matn criticism, or scholars only did isnad criticism. It's just that the two have to work hand in hand, because if there's a problem with the Matn, there's going to be a problem with the sanad. And sometimes a sanad may seem authentic, but the problem in the Matn makes you reconsider the authenticity of it. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing is, after the canonization of hadith, there's this whole issue of the threat of the rationalists. You have to understand that, like, classically, Muslim scholars were always going head to head with the Mu'tazila. And the Mu'tazila rationalists were those people who said, we really don't care about the isnad. They threw the baby out with the bathwater. So if you check the Kitab al-Tahrish of Dirar ibn Amr, if you check Jahidh, you look at Abu al-Qasim al-Ka'bi, you look at some of these early Mu'tazila and their approach to hadith, they're very dismissive. Very dismissive. Isnad doesn't feature, it doesn't play a huge role. So in the face of this threat, scholars had to be very careful not to give any leverage to these hadith, to these Mu'tazila, by saying that the hadith is just Matn problem. So you look at the Tarikh al-Kabir of Imam Bukhari, there are a number of ahadith where he critiques a Matn, but then he says, تَفَرَّدَ بِهِ fulan. He immediately rephrases it in the form of a sanad criticism, so that no Mu'tazili can turn around and say that, oh, what's the difference between you and I? I'm saying the Matn is problematic, you're saying the Matn is problematic. But the distinction is, he's saying it's a problem, but he's saying that the Matn problem comes from an isnad problem. Once the hadith are collected, mudawwan, now you're in marhalatu ma ba'd al-riwaya, you have somebody like Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah. In his Al-Manar al-Munif, he says, you don't even need to look at the asanid. Here are all of the ahadith that are mawdu' just by looking at the content. He could do that because the issue of isnad is no longer an issue, because everything is compiled in books. The Mu'tazila aren't a threat anymore, and you're somewhat preaching to the choir. Okay? In the modern day, this whole issue has resurfaced. And people, no need to mention names, but more hadith critical individuals who are more progressive in their outlook, they just criticize hadith and they say, based on the idea that it's dhanni, it's problematic, I'm going to criticize it and throw it out right now. In this case, are they allowed to do Matn criticism? In theory, the gates of Matn criticism are open, but as the early scholars of hadith mentioned, if you have a proposal of why the Matn is problematic, you have to tie that in with a sanad problem. Otherwise, you're being arbitrary. And that was the main critique of the Mu'tazila, that they would say that the hadith is matnan problematic regardless of the sanad, because they didn't even roll up their sleeves and interact with the sanad, because they said the entire hadith tradition is problematic. That's a very lazy approach. As opposed to saying, you know what, this hadith seems very hard for me to understand. Let me go back into the chain of transmission and maybe I can uncover some ilal. I'm not going to speak too specifically about a hadith, but I'm going to give you an example. There was a hadith I was looking at, and it's an authentic hadith, but the problem with the hadith is, there were some problems with the hadith, let's just say it that way. And then the narrator was Hammam ibn Munabbih. If you know Hammam ibn Munabbih, he's thiqa, he's reliable. But then, as I was looking at his tarjama, I found Ali ibn al-Madini say that إِلَّا أَحْرُفٌ يَسِيرًا. There are some instances where Hammam ibn Munabbih made a mistake. Not to be confused for Wahb ibn Munabbih, the narrator of Israeliyat, but Hammam ibn Munabbih, in some place he made a mistake. And now you have something to hold on to and say, okay, the Matn issue that I am witnessing over here could potentially fall under the ahruf yasira that Ali ibn al-Madini is hinting toward, among other things. So now, It's not only a Matn issue, you have a viable explanation within the Sanad. And that is the difference between the approach of the Ahlul Hadith or the Sunni Hadith criticism and the approach of the Mu'tazila, where you can analyze and critique the Matn, but make sure it's couched in a robust analysis of the Isnad as well. That analysis may not have a precedent. It may be an unprecedented, it may be a new approach, that's fine, but make sure you work within the system of the Hadith scholars.
How do we draw a boundary between a genuine and a legitimate Matan criticism, or simply denying and rejecting every hadith just because it doesn't fit with modern assumptions?
So there's a difference between rejecting a hadith that makes you feel uncomfortable versus rejecting a hadith or critically analyzing a hadith because it conflicts with other evidence. So we have to be very specific here. If you have a feminist reading of hadith and someone says this hadith that says that the wife should cook for the husband or obey the husband, do ita' of the husband, for me seems misogynistic, it's problematic, let's throw it away. That's irrelevant. Nobody cares what you feel about the hadith. The hadith, if it's authentic, if it's reliable, rather adjust your worldview to make sense of it. Is the hadith talking about ita'a in the way you think of it? Maybe it's different, and there's interpretation for that. But if there's a hadith that now, so in the first case, it's not really conflicting with raw data. It's conflicting with assumptions and feelings and a particular worldview. Versus saying that there's a hadith that now conflicts with a scientific point, that conflicts with an issue of archaeology, that now you have data. So now you can use a tangible piece of evidence to reassess the hadith. That said, this doesn't mean when somebody feels uncomfortable, automatically we dismiss it. It could be that that person who feels uncomfortable says that my reading of the hadith suggests that the Prophet ﷺ was very equitable. The Prophet ﷺ was very fair. He wouldn't have said this because of X, Y, and Z reason. Okay, then we need to have a conversation about your assumptions. We need to have a conversation about your first principles, about your qawa'id. So there's nothing wrong with that. The one thing about ilm, as scholars have always mentioned, it's like the marketplace of ideas. Scholars can come with whatever ideas, but just make sure you're able to convince your crowd and your audience of scholars, and it goes through the rigorous process. Scholars were never shy from expressing an opinion. So in the modern day, if I feel that, oh, this goes against the ethics of war, or this goes against gender norms, or this goes against how I view politics or whatnot, okay, I'm allowed to express that view, but I don't express it publicly until I'm able to defend it in the court of the ulama, who will then see the ilmi ground of it. And I'll say, I believe that this hadith that says you should, whatever, you should kill X number of people in war, I disagree with that hadith. Why? These are the qawaid, this is the illah in the matan, blah, 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 blah. All of the issues that I have. Now somebody would turn around and say, wait, the only reason you found this illah is because you're living in the modern world. You're bending backwards for modern issues. And the response to that could easily be, well, at some point when scholars came up with their problems in hadith, it was a modern problem for them. The issue isn't the timing. The issue is how strong am I able to now convince my audience? Like, there are a number of issues. Like the one hadith I was reading recently was the hadith of Jassasa. The famous hadith about Tamim ad-Dari, and he goes to the, he goes to the island. There was a recent study done where the hadith has a number of ilal. And I know scholars were pushing back and saying that, oh, the only reason you're finding illah in this now is because you're living in the modern world and you're struggling to make sense of how a boat could be in another island and all of that stuff. And I say to that person that, look, I could care less when an objection rises. Whether it's yesterday, whether it's today, whether it's tomorrow, whether it's in the pre-modern world, modern world, post-modern world, it doesn't matter. What matters for the ulama is the efficacy and the strength of your argument. If you can prove your argument, then I don't care if you're motivated by modernist agendas or whatnot, but as ulama, we look at the ilm, we follow the trail of evidence.
But otherwise, the case is that the comparison is between, not with the modern worldview, but with the Quran itself. And if someone claims that, okay, the hadith is completely against the Quranic ayat, So
Yeah. The
that
problem
means
with that is, I think, as one scholar put it, sometimes interpreting the Quran is kind of like statistics. You can interpret it however you want, but that's not how it works. You have to see experts who agree or disagree with your assessment. And that's why this idea of mukhalafa of the zahir of the Quran is a very slippery slope, because as we understand, the Quran oftentimes in its dalala allows multiple readings. So is it that it conflicts with the Quran, or is it that the Quran is doing sharh of it? And this is something that the books of tafsir get into detail. I do feel though that some people tend to be overly dismissive of hadith simply because they feel it contradicts with the Quran. But then you look at the verse of the Quran and you think like, wait a second, it's actually not that explicit on the issue.
so. Mufti Sahab will come to this now. So can a scholar uh, reinterpret a hadith? For example, Hazrat Ashraf Ali Thanvi Rahmatullahi, when he speaks about tafsir bil rai, right, regarding the Quran. So he says कि तफसीर bil rai वो है जो शरई और अरबी कवायद के खिलाफ हो, which is against tafsir bil rai is that which is against the shari usul and the Arabic kawaid, right? Which means that merely the absence of a precedent doesn't make a tafsir bil rai.
Yeah.
Can we apply the same principle on hadith as well?
Yeah, to a large extent, as long as your interpretation does not undermine the wording of the hadith and doesn't undermine other established principles of Islam, then it's perfectly fine. I think we're seeing this more and more today, especially with the hadith of Malahim, the end of time. Certain ahadith should be reread as meaning something completely different. That when what is your shoe will talk to you, is it referring to a phone? Is the animal referring to a plane? And you're doing interpretations like that. I don't think it's a big issue, as long as the stakes. Remember, some issues have theological implications, some issues have legal implications, and some issues just have, historical implications, and some are just matters of, tadabbur and tafakkur. Depending on the issue and the hadith, I think there is scope for reinterpretation, and the field of sharh al-hadith is very vast. Remember, the bigger issue has to do with thubut. Once you start getting into dalala, depending on the consequences, there is a lot of latitude and give. Scholars are very flexible with that.
The best example that comes to mind, Hazrat Ashraf Ali Thanvi Rahmatullahi, when he speaks about this hadith, any qawm that gives its affairs to a woman will not succeed. So, have you read about this? I guess Shoaib's, what's his name? Shoaib Saeed or someone, he wrote that article about it.
Sheikh Salman, can you hear me?
Yes, Salman Yunus. Yes.
Yes.
So he wrote this whole article, and the take of the stance that Hazrat Ashraf Ali Thanvi Rahmatullahi took, and how he distinguished between the hadith and the modern context.
Yeah.
So it was unprecedented, and irrespective of whether it was accepted by the scholars or not, he was bold enough to take a step.
100%.
But in today's time, so it's very hard. You have to face the backlash.
Yeah, I think it depends though, right? Like when we talk about backlash, and this is something, mashallah, it's no foreigner to you and I. We see it a lot. Certain contexts, certain places tend to have more harshness in the way they respond compared to others. I think sometimes once we get out of a particular bubble, you'll begin to realize that al-ilmu rahimun bayna ahli. Sometimes we face backlash, or we see scholars push back a lot when we're in our small little circles. Once you get out of that circle and you start interacting with the ulama of different manahij and masharib, and you start bouncing off ideas, you're like, oh, wait a second. This scholar was much more receptive. I remember there's this one approach I took to a hadith, and I ran it by one or two scholars from, our traditional ulama, and let's just say the response was a little harsh. It wasn't too welcoming. And then I went to Turkey. I was traveling, and I met some Syrian scholars over there. And I sat with them and I spoke to them, and they were very open to the idea, and they were very welcoming. And then it clicked that sometimes, we like to generalize. I'm talking about myself here. This is my weakness. because of the experience we have with certain individuals or certain madaris, certain backgrounds, we assume that this is the ulama class, that they're not very welcoming. Then you start traveling, you go to Egypt, you go to Morocco, you go to Istanbul, you go to, Ghana, you go to Nigeria, Sudan, Somalia, you go to India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, you go to Uzbekistan. You're traveling, and you're meeting the scholars. Yes, you'll find people who are very harsh, but then you'll find ulama who tend to resonate with your challenges. And I think that's the important thing here. A lot of times when someone is bold enough, so long as they're qualified and the interpretation is within the scope of acceptability, and they come up with a view, people generally give backlash because they don't share the same concerns and challenges that they view. I mean, just take something as basic as the issue of tasweer, photography. Like right now, you and I are doing a recording and we're discussing. For some people, the issue of photography is the most make it or break it issue after, like the qat'i haram issues. And that's fine. That's the approach that they go with. And then you go to other places of the world where they don't even bat an eye. Like this issue of photography is a non-issue for them. And they're ulama. You're talking about senior ulama, muftis of their places, muhaddithun. That's their approach. Oftentimes, a reaction is to what a person is used to. So if you and I are, let's say, for instance, giving da'wah to non-Muslims, and that's my entire experience, the types of answers that I will give, the types of interpretations that I need to dig up, the types of approaches I need to take will seem like a huge compromise to someone who lives in a city, 100% Muslim, generationally Muslim, they only meet Muslims, they don't interact with the outside world. Understandably, whatever interpretation approach I take will be seen as a slap to their face. But that shouldn't be of concern to me. What should be of concern to me is I go back and I speak to the ulama that I feel can understand the context. And this is important because just because my context is different doesn't mean what I'm saying is right. I need to find a backing corroboration. I'll go speak to ulama who have a similar scope of the way I'm approaching things. And if they agree, then okay, your interpretation does have some grounding.
So, sir, we are almost out of time. So I'll just ask you two questions. So without naming any individual, like we have few individuals who are saying that, okay, the whole hadith corpus, it's valuable. It has value, but it's just a historical record. The most important thing is the Quran and then the Sunnah. As the hadith states, "Ma taraktu fikum amrayn, kitabullah wa sunnati," right? So they say that this Sunnah has already reached us through Amri Tawatur. It has already reached us. As for the hadith, had it not existed, there wouldn't be any difference at all. It wouldn't affect the Quran, it wouldn't affect the deen.
Yeah.
So they don't dismiss the hadith corpus in wholesale, but at the same time, they say that this has reached us. As for hadith, it is not essential.
Yeah. So this is something that scholars as early as Imam Shafi'i were dealing with. And they said that the idea of like tawatur amali, the idea of praxis, mashallah, it's valuable, right? Like amal ahlul Madina, amal al-Kufa, like these things are valuable. But you're kidding yourself if you think somehow a nation, ummah, a civilization as vast, spanning from one side of Spain all the way to the other side of Central Asia, will somehow have an intact, coherent practice amal in anything beyond the generalities. So Imam Shafi'i is saying like, adhan, salah, things like that. Yeah, sunnah, tawatur amali, tawaruth amali is definitely beneficial. But the devil's in the details. Now when you want to figure out specifics, what do? That's where you now need to take recourse to recorded, documented data. So, is it fair to say that the sunnah is preserved in practice? Yes, insofar as the general items and the usul of Islam are concerned. The usul of aqidah, usually homogeneous throughout the Muslim world. Amal of like adhan, salah, hajj, that's fine. But the issue is nobody's debating that. Once you start getting into the specifics, how are you meant to fill in this image with the specific pixels? Now, you either min indiyati, you just pull things out of your pocket and say, I want this to be the deen, I want that to be the deen, or you have a more feasible alternative, historical data that the scholars of hadith have documented through rigorous methods, which doesn't mean each data point is compelling, but at least it's an alternative that allows you to fill in the specifics based on a methodology of usul al-fiqh and aqidah and fiqh and whatnot. So to somehow assume that if hadith were never documented, we would have a holistic understanding of Islam is completely untrue. Because how are you, and this was interestingly when Imam Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani and Imam Abu Yusuf were debating some of the people of Medina, and they were talking about amal. And they said that, okay, you have amal, right? And this is, widely practiced. What will allow you to anchor your practice into something objective? Like, how do I know your practice doesn't go back to some random street seller? How do I know that your practice is continuous? That's why, like every other tradition, practice only helps for a few generations, after which you need an observable, tangible data to anchor your debate. And that's why when Imam Shafi'i, and influenced by Imam Muhammad, starts to centralize athar and hadith and, documented information, it's a hit. Now everybody's running with it because they realize to say amal is what I'm going to use as evidence, it's so ambiguous that you can't really achieve anything. What's better off is saying that I concede to the hadith, yes, with certain principles, that this hadith I may not accept, that hadith I may reinterpret, but this complete dismissal of hadith because the sunnah preserved it is just, it's I hate to be mean about it, but it's just this wishful thinking that is untrue.
So just as a layman argument, if someone says like, what if Imam Bukhari didn't exist or Bukhari didn't exist? Or like someone says, Hazrat Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu, he destroyed the hadith that he had, right? And even we have many instances where scholars, they destroyed the hadith corpus that they had with them. So if it was that important, so how do we know that which has been burnt or destroyed, they don't have information, essential information?
So, few things. Number one, if Imam Bukhari was never born, the hadith tradition would be exactly the same. If you look at the number of hadith Imam Bukhari transmits, there's about one or two hadith that are unique to Sahih al-Bukhari, not found elsewhere. So in a hypothetical world, if Imam Bukhari was never born, Ibn Taymiyyah actually mentions this. He says that it would not leave a dent in the corpus of hadith. As for hadith scholars who burnt their collections, you have to understand there's a difference between burning personal notes because they're what you call draft ideas versus burning established collections of hadith. That never happened. When you have people saying that, oh, burn my collection after I die, it's because it's kind of like, honestly, I would do the same thing. Before I pass away, I'm going to give a wasiyah, take all my notes and burn them because I'm not too happy with the quality of my notes. But don't touch my published books because my published books, mashallah, I use enough time to make sure that it went through the editorial process. So those Sahaba, those Tabi'un who bequeathed that their books be collected, they weren't referring to books that were edited and finalized for public consumption. These were private notes that could easily be misread. Right? So I think it's a misnomer to assume the two. And the last thing I will say is that the hadith tradition is not dependent on any individual. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sakhara lana, as they say, He subjugated, He inspired a galaxy of scholars from different regions, different times, different backgrounds, all of whom contributed to the science. If there was no Yahya ibn Ma'in, the science would be perfectly fine. If there was no Ali ibn al-Madini, then there would have been Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. If there was no Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Qattan, there would have been Abdurrahman ibn Mahdi. If there was no Sufyan al-Thawri, there would have been a Sufyan ibn Uyayna. If there was no Imam Malik, there would have been Imam Shafi'i. If there was no Ayyub al-Sakhtiyani, there would have been an Ibn Sirin. So on and so forth. Like, we're not dependent on a single individual. It's a collective that worked together and, made this field as robust as it is today.
If I remember, the author of the Min al-Nabi al-Bukhari. So he mentioned that there are two hadiths, but he then goes on to say that it is only one unique hadith, and that is also related to furu'at.
Yeah.
So everything would be mahfuz.
Yeah.
So the last question, Mufti Sahab, if supposedly there is a student of knowledge who has completed his Alimiyya, he wants to get deep and excel in the field of hadith. Name me three books which you feel that it is a must-have, and why?
That's hard. You know, التخصص في الحديث based on 3 books is but I get what you're saying. If there
As
were
a
3
starting
books
point, as a starting point.
as a starting point to get students into okay, I would look at it from ooh, this is good. This is a very good question, you know, because I have so many books that come to mind immediately. Okay. I would choose first I would choose one of Sheikh Hatim's books, maybe like his Sharh al-Muqidha, to get the latest cutting edge research in Mustalah. Like, I like the way he summarizes all of the modern debates. Sheikh Hatim al-Auni, he has a number of books on Mustalah, but some of his books do a phenomenal job at summarizing all of the key debates. So if you read that one book, you'll get a good grasp of it. Obviously, there's Sheikh Muhammad Awama's Tadrib al-Rawi, but that's way too extensive. Sheikh Hatim Auni's books tend to, in more brevity, summarize a lot of the key issues. That's the first book I would say. The second book, given that it's what we're discussing right now, this book called Atharul Ilm al-Tajribi, it shows how we can use modern science to we can use modern science to revisit some of the hadith and see if there's an illah in those hadith or not. I'm not too concerned with the hadith itself, but I appreciate how it opens up a new door for students to think very broadly the potential that a naqd al-hadithi has for hadith in general. And the third is, I feel students have a very myopic understanding of hadith, and we need to like broaden our scope and see, okay, how do Orientalists approach hadith? What is the claims of the Shia related to hadith? What do Mu'tazila have to say about hadith? And for that, I would say Dr. Jonathan Brown's book, One World Press, Hadith, is a very good introduction. Although it's very brief, it's written in academic language, which means it's very neutral. It's not the most healthy read from a confessional perspective, but it's a very good window into hadith as studied in multiple areas. So it broadens your scope. So these 3 books, one helps build on your knowledge of Mustalah, giving you all the cutting edge research. The second book expands your application of ilal into the modern realm. And the third shows you how hadith was critiqued by Orientalists, responded to by Muslim scholars. What do the Shia have to say about hadith? What do the rationalists say? Is there a Sufi approach to hadith? And more importantly, even the classical Sunni approach to hadith being described in an idiom that's much more relevant to us. So I would say these are the 3 books. Even though, honestly, I could add 50 other books, it's just these are the 3 that come to mind immediately.
So I hope the audience have benefited from the conversation, inshallah. And thank you, Mufti Saab. I think it's time to end the podcast. Thank you for your time. Wallah, I have, mashallah, benefited a lot from your talk. Everything that you said. May Allah reward you for this. And hopefully, next time, someday, inshallah, we'll have a topic again and discuss it again, inshallah.
I mean, Jazakallah khairan. I really appreciate you inviting me here. And I do understand maybe some of what I have said is problematic or wrong. May Allah forgive me if anything I've said wrong is from myself and shaitan. Anything I said is right is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I'm more than willing to reconsider any of my positions. Like I said, this is the idea of ilm that we discuss. Al-ilmu bil-munaqasha, right? Like we have this munaqasha, mudhakara, and if any place I'm wrong, I would love to be corrected, and I hope that I can contribute in any meaningful way to the tullabul ilm, all of whom are much more closer to Allah than myself and more educated than I am, but we're just trying to contribute as much as we can. May Allah forgive us for our shortcomings. Allahumma ja'alni khayran mimma yadhunnun waghfir li ma la ya'lamun.
Ameen.